Good morning and welcome to episode 67 of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Today's episode is actually two stories, but they're actually not even related to each other. And really, the only thing they have in common is that they took place around the same time, or the same time period anyway. But let's get started so you'll know what I'm talking about. Alright, so there's this page that I follow on Facebook, and it's called A Mighty Girl. Now, this page is all about female role models, and they share books, movies, and even toys that promote raising strong, smart, courageous, and confident girls. Well, about a week ago, they recommended a book called Lucy Fights the Flames, and it's written by Julie Kathleen Gilbert. The book tells of a 14-year-old girl named Lucy who was working at Triangle Shirtwaist factory when the factory basically caught on fire back in 1911. Well, I had never heard of this before, so you know me, I had to go check it out. So Triangle Shirtwaist factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, and the Ash Building had been built back in 1901. It stands on the New York University campus. Now, some of this story reminds me of the Woolworths fire that we talked about back on a midweek mini back in, I believe it was February. But the death toll from this factory fire was much bigger than what happened with Woolworths. Now, that factory itself produced women's blouses, and it employed around 500 people. Pretty much all the employees were women and girls who were either Italian or Jewish immigrants. And we've talked about how the working conditions in these factories were back then, and this factory was really no different. The women and girls who worked there, they worked 9 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and then came back in on Saturday and did another 7 hours. And the pay was terrible because they averaged between like $7 and $12 a week. That's not really much to live off of. Now, just before quitting time on March 25th, 1911, fire broke out in a bin underneath the cutting tables on the 8th floor. About 5 minutes later, as somebody was walking by outside of the factory, they noticed smoke coming from the 8th floor, so they notified the fire authorities. A bookkeeper who walked on the 8th floor was able to warn others on the 10th floor by telephone, but back in those days, there were no smoke detectors or fire alarms, I guess, and I guess on the 9th floor, they didn't have telephones, and so the 9th floor really had no idea what was going on around them. Now, the factory did have fire escapes set up, and there was also freight elevators. But the flames kept the workers from getting to those escapes on the Green Street side of that building. On the Washington Place side, doors were locked to prevent workers from sneaking out with stuff they'd stolen from the factory. And to make that even worse, The supervisor who had the key to those locked doors had already escaped the fire by taking some other route out of the building. Now, a handful of employees, they were able to escape the flames by taking the Green Street escape to the roof, but soon that stairway became unstable, and when that happened, a lot of the employees jammed themselves onto the rickety staircase on the outside of the building. Well, it gave way under all that weight of all those people, and it hurled 20 employees 100 feet to their deaths. In the meantime that all of this was going on, the fire department arrived, and it didn't take them very long, but they weren't able to get the fire under control, and that was mostly because the ladders that they had only reached to the 7th floor of the building. And another reason they were having a hard time getting to the fire to extinguish it was because on the sidewalk all around the building, there was bodies of those who had fallen, and they were continuing to fall. So they had to work around that too. Now, those employees who hadn't tried to make it up to the roof or had not tried that faulty staircase outside, they waited to be rescued, but soon those employees were overcome by smoke and flames. Two of the factory's elevator workers, their names were Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortellaro. They were able to save a few people from the 9th floor, but eventually Mortellaro had to stop because the heat of the fire was causing the rails in the elevator system to buckle. Other people in the factory pried open the elevator doors. They were thinking that they could jump to the cables and slide down those to escape the fire, but sadly, they didn't hit their mark of holding on to those rails to slide down, and they were basically hitting the top of the elevator, and this was on Zito's elevator, and so it made it impossible for him to rescue more. It was the weight was just too much for the elevator. Well, in the end, 146 people were dead, including 62 who had jumped or fallen to their deaths in an effort of escaping that fire. One couple, and y'all, this is so sad and it just breaks my heart. One couple who had jumped to their deaths had been seen kissing in a window just before they jumped. So what caused this big tragedy? Well, there were several theories on that. I already spoke about the fire and the bin underneath the cutting table, but smoking in the factory was prohibited. But it was known that some of the cutters would sneak in cigarettes, and the fire marshal concluded that the fire had been started by either a match or a cigarette that had not been extinguished and was dropped into that bin under the cutting table. A New York Times article stated that the cause could have been the engines running the sewing machines. And yet there was another theory that suggested that arson was a common factor with fires that involved the garment industry because, if their products had went out of season, or out of fashion, and they weren't selling, or they had this large inventory they weren't getting rid of, the factory would just suddenly go down in flames so that the insurance money could be collected. The factory owners, their names were Max Blank and Isaac Harris, and they both survived the fire by escaping through the roof. But they were both indicted on first and second degree manslaughter charges. Their trial began the following December, but when the trial ended, both men were acquitted of those manslaughter charges. Now, 2 years later, a civil lawsuit was filed against those men, and they were held liable for wrongful death. And the sad thing is the plaintiffs in that case were each awarded only $75. Because, y'all, this is the part that really, really gets me as far as this payout. That insurance company had paid Blank and Harris $60,000 more than what the loss was worth. and had given them $400 for each death. But yet they only had to give the people that filed the lawsuit $75 each. Now, that same year, Blanc was caught locking fire exit doors again and was fined a mere $20. Now, this was at a new factory that he was running, but he was fined just a mere $20, which was the minimum fee or fine at that time. And it just goes to show how greed and money take precedence over human lives for some people. And one thing I should add about those factory owners is that they were also immigrants. They came from the same places in life that their employees had, but somehow they thought they were above them. Now, the next story takes place in a factory also, but this time it was in Atlanta, Georgia. Leo Max Frank was born to a Jewish American family in Texas back in 1884. He was raised in New York and received a mechanical engineering degree from Cornell. After receiving that degree, he moved to Georgia in 1908, and 2 years later, he got married. Now, during the time that he was getting married and everything, he became employed as the director of the National Pencil Company. Well, back in those times, child labor was a hot topic. The factory Frank was employed at had its fair, or maybe I should say unfair, number of child employees. And one of those child employees was a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan. On an April morning in 1913, Mary's body was discovered in the company's cellar. She had been strangled, and beside her body, notes were found that had been made to look like Mary had written them. And one of those notes mentioned a night witch, and that was interpreted to mean night watch. So naturally, the night watchman on duty, his name was Newt Lee. He was implicated but later cleared. But we're going to talk a little bit more in depth. So first we're going to talk about Mary a little bit. Now, Mary was born in 1899, and sadly before she was born, her father passed away. After her father's death, her mom moved them to an Atlanta suburb and opened up a boarding house. Well, when Mary was only 10 years old, she quit school, and this was very common back in those times, but she quit school and went to work at a factory. Her mom remarried and moved the family further into Atlanta, and that's when Mary became employed by the National Pencil Company, earning only 10 cents an hour, and she ran a machine that put the erasers in the little metal end on pencils. And her job was located just across the hallway from Leo Frank's office. In April of 1913, Mary had gotten laid off from her job because of material shortages. On April 26th, she went into the factory to get her pay, and that was the last time anybody would see her alive. Shortly before 3 a.m. the next morning, the night watchman that I was talking about earlier, he went into the cellar to use the restroom, and as he was coming back out, he found Mary's body, and that's when he called the police. Now, these details they're a lot disturbing, okay, but she had apparently been raped. Her skirt was up around her waist, a piece of her petticoat was ripped, her underwear was still around her hips, but they had been torn and they were bloody. The torn off piece from her petticoat was wrapped around her neck, as well as a 7-foot long piece of wrapping cord, and that wrapping cord was a 1/4 inch deep in the skin on her neck. So she had been strangled. Her head had also been bruised and battered. It's so awful to think what that poor young child must have went through. The bloody fingerprints were found at a door on a service ramp that was found to have been tampered with, so it didn't have to be unlocked. Like I said earlier, Newt Lee was arrested for the crime, and so was a friend of Mary's, but soon the police believed that neither of these people were responsible for her death. Blood was found on the second floor, and that's where Frank's office was located. When Lee found Mary's body that morning, he tried calling Frank, but he got no answer. And the police later tried calling Frank that same morning, but they didn't get an answer either. Well, finally, when they did make contact with him, with that Frank dude, he agreed to go with them to the factory. Now, the police hadn't told Frank exactly why they needed to see him there, but the first thing they noticed was how nervous Frank was acting. He was actually shaking. His face was pale, and he could barely speak. When Mary Fagan's name was brought up, Frank said that wasn't a name that he was familiar with, and he would have to look through his payroll records. But they took him to the morgue to look at her. Now, even though they were suspicious because of his nervousness, he still wasn't arrested at that time. But the following day, Frank lawyered up and handed police a written deposition that gave a timeline of what he had been doing on that Saturday. And at his attorney's insistence, Frank stripped all of his clothes off to show that he had no cuts or injuries. He also gave them the suit that he had worn, or said that he had worn, on that Saturday, and police found no blood on it or in any of the laundry at the Frank's house. Not only did he lawyer up, but he also hired a private detective to prove his innocence. Now, this detective, when he was doing his investigation, had an obligation to turn in any evidence that he found to the police, whether it hurt or helped Frank's case. And it wasn't known by Frank, but that detective was a pretty close buddy of the police. On the following Tuesday, the detective went to the night watchman's home to look for evidence. And in a burn barrel outside, he found a bloodstained shirt. But y'all, the thing about this shirt is that, other than the bloodstain, it was clean, like it had never even been worn at all. So it was planted there to make Lee look guilty. Well, later that same day, Frank was arrested at the factory. On Wednesday, there was a coroner's inquest, which, is not the trial, but anyway, they, talked to different people involved in this case, and one of Mary's friends testified that she had complained to him about Frank, and even other employees spoke about how Frank would flirt with women. On May 23rd of that year, the grand jury met to examine the evidence against Frank, and the following day he was officially indicted. At the end of July, the trial began, and it was quite the media sensation. They couldn't even fit all the people into the courtroom. There was people outside the courtroom as well. Both the defense and the prosecution went in heavy, trying to prove their cases. The prosecution relied heavily on Frank's alleged inappropriate sexual behavior and even had witnesses backing up those claims. But of course, the defense had their own set of witnesses who said they'd never seen Frank flirting with or touching women. The defense also asked for a mistrial because they believed that the jury was influenced by people inside and outside of the courthouse, but that motion was denied. And then finally, on August 26th, the jury reached a guilty plea, or a guilty decision, and Judge Ron sentenced Frank to death by hanging on the following October the 10th. Naturally, the defense appealed that conviction, and the appeals process, of course, drug on for quite a while. And as each appeal was denied, a new one was filed, going all the way to the federal system. When they ran out of appeals, the defense moved on to requesting that his death sentence be commuted. And after another lengthy, prolonged process, on June 21st, 1915, it was announced that Frank's sentence had been commuted to life in prison. Well, as you can imagine, the public was just like utterly outraged. There were threats to attack the governor. And on August 16th, 8 cars left the Marietta, Georgia area, bound for Milledgeville. And they had taken Frank to a prison in Milledgeville for his protection the night before they announced that his prison sentence had been commuted. I've never understood the protection of somebody such as Mr. Frank. But anyway, the people in those cars had everything planned out, y'all. An electrician cut the phone cables outside of the prison so nobody could make any calls. Gasoline was drained from the prison's vehicles. And they then handcuffed the warden and drove away with Frank. Now, over the next 7 hours, the group drove back on back roads back to Marietta. And once they were there, Frank was handcuffed, his legs tied at the ankles, and then he was hanged from the branch of a tree that faced in the direction of Mary's childhood home. People from miles around arrived on foot and in cars to see the heinous murderer hanging from the tree. And when his body was cut down, a man named Robert E. Lee Howell stomped his head and chest. And it was also known that Howell had wanted Frank's body cut into small pieces and burned. Well, eventually, Frank's body was transported back to New York and buried in the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale, Queens. A new governor was in office in Georgia at that time. His name was Nat Harris. And he promised that the lynch mob would be punished. But nothing ever came of that because, we all know that nobody's going to be giving up information on who was involved, like who the members of that mob was. Even though there was photos that exist, and I'm going to have that photo on the cover of this episode. Now, y'all, I swear, in all of the history I learned, I have never heard of that happening. And I'm in South Carolina, that's just in Georgia. And the way I came across this story was that my mom had seen something on Facebook about it, and she shared it with me. And it's a tragic story all the way around, and I truly believe that Frank was guilty, and he deserved what he got in the end. That may make me sound like a horrible, wretched person, but I'm sorry. I just feel like karma's a bitch. But anyway. Well, y'all, that's it for today's episode of Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Don't forget to come back on Wednesday for an all-new midweek mini.